It was said that the most effective way for the young people in Chang and to compete with each other was not to compare whose father's position was higher or whose family made more money. For an open and active society like the Tang Empire, social status and wealth accumulation could change drastically at any time. Moreover, it was too vulgar and tasteless. What they valued more was one's talent, reputation, and strength, as well as who was the most popular in Chang'an. Of course, if one wanted to make a living in Chang'an, he could not completely leave his family background. But there were always places where one's family background was not so taboo, such as the House of Red Sleeves and the canteens of various departments. Therefore, it became a place where people competed with each other. Chu Yuxian said that Ning Ke didn't have to pay for drinks at the House of Red Sleeves, which was not an insult, but a real show of support for Ning Quebec. Sure enough, after hearing that Ning Ke could go against the House of Red Sleeves, which no one dared to offend, those young men and women of Chang, and suddenly changed their expressions and looked at Ning Ke with a sense of awe. Not everyone was shocked by Chu Yuxian's shout. For example, Sang Sang looked up and frowned. She stared at young Master Chu's trembling hand on young Master's shoulder, and listened to him talking about young Master's visit to the brothel. She was not in a good mood at all. And Situ Ilan looked at Ning Ke in a weird way. I'm still not convinced. There's only one big question in the math exam. If you're right, you're right, and if you're wrong, you're wrong. The headmaster of the academy has drunk several pots of wine and cut several pounds of plums. It's impossible for him to have several answers. Then why are you A+ while Mr. Xie is only A+? Situ Ilan held Jean Wutsai's little hand and shouted. She was very reluctant. She was not an unruly and unreasonable person, but she knew that her female companion Jean Wutsai admired the third young master of the South Jin Kingdom. At this time, the third young master's limelight was completely overshadowed by Ning Ke, and Jean Wutsai looked a little gloomy, so she could not help but ask a few more questions. In addition, there was a more important reason that she probably did not realize. In the driving course examination, she was thrown to the ground by the big black horse and her face was almost trampled. As the daughter of the Yunhui general, she could not even deal with a horse, which was extremely embarrassing. Then Ning Ke tamed the big black horse so easily and got the only A+ result in the driving course, which was really incomprehensible to her. The A+ result in the math course was even more incomprehensible to her. Since she could not understand it, she was naturally unwilling to accept it. At this moment, an old voice suddenly sounded in the crowd. Because he was the first one to hand in the math exam. Xie Chengyun, Wang Ying, Ning Ke, Chan Simiao. He Yingqin report to the Department of Magic Skills. Ning Ke was stunned when he heard his name. Report to the Department of Magic Skills. What did that mean? Why did he feel like he was going to the Department of Worship? Why did he feel cold between his legs? But it seemed that it was not convenient to ask others, so he said a few words to Sang Sang, and then followed Xie Chengyun and others to the depths of the academy. He was a little relieved when he found that there was also a female examinee going to the Department of Magic Skills. None of the examinees on the stone ground showed a look of surprise. In fact, the main reason why they did not go home was that they wanted to hear whether their names would be called in the Department of Magic Skills. They looked at those people going to the depths of the academy with envy. Situ Ilan kicked the blue stone cracks in disappointment, looking at Ning Ke's back and muttering in a low voice, "Why did all the good things go to this guy?" It did not take long for those 7 or 8 examinees to come back from the depths of the academy, as if they had just gone for a stroll. Xie Chengyun looked calm, Wang Ying and other examinees could not hide their joy, and only Ning Ke's face showed no expression at all. The academy set up a special course in addition to the 6 courses to cultivate students with potential for cultivation. In the future, those students would be exposed to the art of sword and talisman, so it was called the Course of Magic Skills. The instructors thought that those students who were called before had potential, and they went to receive a psyche power examination. The reason why Ning Ke was selected was related to the hairpin-style small regular script he left on the ink scroll today, and his quick response to the math questions. The academy thought that he should have the potential for cultivation, but the instructor who was responsible for the physical examination made a rare failure, and was disappointed to find that his ocean of chi and mountain of snow was blocked. But once again, he experienced the switch between hope and disappointment. If there was no hope, there would be no disappointment. Ning Ke was very clear about his physical condition, so he could face it calmly. Xie Chengyun had already embarked on the road of cultivation when he was in the South Jin Kingdom, so of course there was nothing to be excited about. But Wang Ying and other examinees could hardly suppress their excitement until today when they knew that they might step into the legendary mysterious door. I can't. Ning Ke spread out his hands and explained to the crowd, "Oh, I can't say I can't. The instructor said that my willpower is fine, but my ocean of qi and mountain of snow is a little weak, and my body is not suitable for cultivation." The academy called 7 people by name, and he was the only one who failed the examination. Chapter 80. Situ Ilan opened her eyes wide and stared at the lawn burning like wildfire under the setting sun. She stared at the pair of master and servant who were getting further and further away. She couldn't help but put her hands on her waist and murmured, "This guy is really interesting." Ning Ke did not find these things interesting. Arguing with a bunch of kids was just a waste of time and meaningless. What he was thinking now was that according to the curriculum of the academy, there was a lot of free time left for the students. He should use that time to do something meaningful, such as killing people to earn money. Lying on the bed in the old brush pen shop, he looked at the name on the oil paper and asked, "Are you ready?" Sang Sang was oiling the padao she had just polished. She lowered her head and answered, "New cloth covers and old clothes are ready. But young master, what hairstyle are you going to wear this time? Or from the Yueluan kingdom?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "You make the decision for such a small matter." Sang Sang raised her head and asked, "When are you going to kill him?" "This guy lives in the eastern city not far from here. We can kill him whenever we want." Ning Ke looked at the name on the oil paper and the simple information below. He paused and explained, "We don't even know when to kill him. When the government investigates the case in the future, it won't be easy to calculate something from the law of time. There is no law in the world. But when you kill more people there will be a law." Sang Sang sheathed the bright padao in her hand and walked to the bedside to look at Ning Ke's face. She said seriously, "This is what you taught me when I was young. No matter how you hide yourself, the government will always find out the reason from the identity of the people you killed. The general's mansion is dead, and the villages in the Yen territory are all slaughtered." Ning Ke smiled and answered, "Even if the government finally found out that the killer's purpose was to avenge these 2 things, how could they find me? Maybe they can't find you, young master. But if the government knows who you want to kill, then they can target and protect your targets. They can even directly use those names as bait. At that time, even if you know those people have people from the government around them, won't you kill them?" Ning Ke quietly looked at the little handmaiden's eyes and suddenly laughed. He said, "You rarely think so much." "I'm not really stupid. I'm just too lazy to think." Sang Sang murmured in a low voice. As for why she was willing to think about these things today, she didn't understand. Maybe she didn't understand. Ning Ke understood. So his eyes became a little warm. He looked at her and smiled. "I promise you I'll take a break after killing 2 or 3 people. Then I'll study in the academy." Sang Sang smiled, and her dark face finally showed a relaxed expression. She said, "Yes, the academy is such a good place. Young master, you can meet so many talents of your age. You should cherish it." Ning Ke was not used to Song Song's sudden transformation into Shirin. He could not help but roll his eyes. Looking at the roof, he stretched his right hand under the quilt and counted with his fingers. The so-called same age meant that he was actually 7 or 8 years older than them. The next day, the academy officially started classes. Ning Ke and Sang Sang got up early again. After washing and eating, Sang Sang stood at the door of the shop to see them off, while Ning Ke boarded the horse carriage alone. Sang Sang and Ning Ke got up early the next day. After washing and eating, Sang Sang stood at the door of the shop to see them off. Ning Ke boarded the carriage alone. At dawn, the south gate of Chang'an opened. Dozens of carriages with the academy's logo came out one by one. Judging from the number of carriages, most of the students in the academy didn't want to go back and forth and chose to live on campus. They hurried south along the willow-shaded official road. Along the way they saw flowers, fields, and water. When the curtains were lifted, they saw the steep mountain and the meadow and flowering trees at the foot of the mountain. Although it was the second time Ning Ke saw it, he still couldn't help sighing again. It seemed that such a wonderful fairyland could appear in the human world. In the bustling suburbs of Chang'an, More than 10 black horse carriages climbed on the green meadow, and soon arrived at the front gate of the academy. The students got off the carriages one after another and greeted each other with cupped hands. In front of the simple stone gate that was not very eye-catching, there were already many residents who had entered the examination room yesterday to welcome them. The quiet courtyard gate suddenly became lively. The young students all wore the academy's cyan robes. The boys wore black headscarves, while the girls used ebony hairpins to tie up their black hair. Together with the green meadow and the simple stone gate, they looked particularly refreshing. Coupled with the youthful vigor on their faces, a youthful aura spread in all directions as they faced the rising sun in the east. Ning-Kei tidied up his cyan robe and took out the small bronze mirror that Sang-Sang had put in his bag last night. He checked whether the black headscarf on his head was worn crookedly. After confirming it, he got off the carriage. In yesterday's academy exam, apart from Xie Chengyun and the other two from the South Jin Kingdom, the big black horse who had tamed the big black horse was the most conspicuous one. When the students who were exchanging greetings at the gate saw him, they did not avoid him out of jealousy. Instead, they warmly greeted him and exchanged information about recent events and introduced themselves. The bell in the depths of the academy rang quietly. Living in a difficult environment since childhood, he would instinctively judge any sudden situation as dangerous. A scholar appeared in front of the alley without anyone noticing. This scholar had straight eyebrows and wide eyes, with a simple and amiable expression. He wore an old cotton gown that seemed too thick in the spring, and a pair of broken straw shoes. Both the old cotton gown and the broken straw shoes were covered with dust, as if they had not been washed for many years. But somehow this person looked unusually clean. From the body to the heart, he was incomparably clean. The scholar held a scroll in his right hand, and a wooden dipper was tied to his waist. Ning-Kei's gaze moved back and forth between the scroll and the wooden dipper twice, and finally fell on the scholar's face. His right hand in his sleeve gradually loosened. This was the academy, where no one in the whole world dared to do anything improper here. Moreover, although this scholar was covered with dust, he gave people a feeling of being as clean as a newborn baby. No matter who saw him, they would subconsciously want to be trusted by him, as if everything he said or did should be taken for granted. Ning-Kei's body relaxed, but he became extremely nervous, because he felt that he trusted this scholar who had suddenly appeared. For someone like him who had struggled between life and death since he was a child and had decided not to trust anyone for the rest of his life, this kind of unexplainable and irresistible sense of trust was a very terrifying thing. He could not be hostile to this scholar at all. What made him feel even more terrified was that he had a very clear feeling that even if he took out the big black umbrella behind him, there was no way he could pose any threat to the scholar in front of him at all. The scholar in a cotton robe smiled slightly, and his gaze fell on the cloth cover behind Ning-Kei, as if he could see what was inside. He patted the wooden dipper at his waist and asked, "The umbrella behind you is not bad, do you want to exchange it?" How does this person know that there is an umbrella in the cloth cover behind me, and a big black umbrella at that? Ning-Kei felt that his lips and tongue were parched, and he could not speak at all. After a long silence, he firmly shook his head. The scholar sighed with some regret, and walked past him with the scroll in his hand. He did not look at Ning-Kei again, and walked to a remote side door of the academy. There was a lonely ox cart parked outside the side door of the academy. The scholar walked to the side of the cart, and very seriously bowed to the carriage, and then sat on the shaft of the cart to pick up the ox whip. An ordinary old man's voice came out from the cart, accompanied by a strong smell of wine. "He doesn't want to exchange with you?" The scholar smiled and shook his head. Then he waved the ox whip, and the ox cart slowly began to move forward. In the spring of the 13th year of Tianqi era, the headmaster of the academy took his eldest disciple on another trip to other countries. He did not know how many pots of wine he would drink on this trip. He would cut a few pounds of plum on a few mountains. Chapter 82. What is etiquette? This is a very broad and grand proposition, but we can't stop exploring and studying it just because it's a grand proposition, because it's very important. This word is as lofty and untouchable as the firmament, so should we stop casting curious gazes at the firmament? Of course not. We observe the clouds and wind during the day, and observe the stars at night. We want to know what the firmament is, and we want to know what's up there. Such a grand proposition needs to be answered in a way that we can understand. Then our answer must be specific, and we must inquire about the subtlety and the specific details. We look up at the starry sky, watch the stars move, and draw the beautiful and constant lines in our hearts. Finally, it becomes the art of stargazing. What is the firmament? We have to experience and comprehend it from the specific lines, the clouds, the upper edge of the breadth between heaven and earth, and the upper limit of the fluctuation of the primordial chi. It's the same for etiquette. If you want to ask me, what kind of answer will you get if you look into the specifics of etiquette and find the nouns in the embodiment? I can only say my own understanding. The so-called etiquette is the rule. The teacher in charge of the etiquette course was an associate professor of the Academy's etiquette department. He was about 60 years old and he spoke very slowly and clearly. The content of the lecture was also quite organized. The students in front of their desks were listening very carefully. However, Ning-Kei was already drowsy. The clearer the instructor spit out the words, the more he felt the drowsiness in his mind, and the more irresistible it was. He was at the bottom of the Academy's etiquette course in the last grade, and he had never been interested in these contents in his previous life. In recent years he had been busy writing, meditating, killing, arson, gambling, and sleeping. He was really helpless. In a daze, Ning-Kei could not help but wonder how painful it would be if his life in the academy in the next few years was to waste all the good time in the morning on this cliché. What happened next in the study room saved him from this desperate fantasy. He once again understood that the academy, which had a high status in the Tang Empire, was not an ordinary place, and the teacher in charge here was indeed not an ordinary person. When the old teacher said that etiquette was the rule, a disapproving voice suddenly rang out in the study room. Teacher, the Tang Empire's prestige has conquered the 4 seas, and the Holy Son of Heaven has reigned over the world. Re-establishing the Book of Etiquette does not depend on following the rules. According to the rules of the academy, students were allowed to ask questions in class, so it was normal for the student to question him. But it was the first day of school after all, so the atmosphere in the study room suddenly became a bit weird. But other than that, I really don't know what other cultivation books you can think of but can't find. Hearing this, Ning-Kei, who stood outside the crowd, slowly clenched his fists in his sleeves. Although his expression did not change, his heartbeat sped up for no reason. He subconsciously raised his head and stared at the ordinary 3-story wooden building in front of him. His burning gaze seemed to want to ignite the wooden building. Entering the cultivation world had been his dream since he was young. Although he had been repeatedly defeated yesterday, the reason why the dream was beautiful was precisely because it was difficult to realize. But it also attracted him to try hard, and from time to time, he would show his little tail to tempt him and moan softly, "Come after me, come and catch me." He, who had long since given up hope of entering the cultivation world, suddenly found himself able to enter and exit a wooden building filled with cultivation books. For a young man who had spared no effort in traveling to several markets in the frontier fortress in order to buy a copy of the article on the response of the highest being, this was a sudden and indescribable happiness. Let me remind all of you not to look too greedy. Otherwise, if you really burn the old library down, the headmaster will cut all of us into peach branches and swallow us with wine. The instructor downstairs looked at Ning-Kei, who was outside the crowd, with a faint smile. Then he stopped smiling and looked at the students with a serious expression. He said, "I have to warn all of you that the mysterious books that you are curious about cannot be memorized. You can only experience them. As for the reason behind them, I will still not explain it. After all, human strength is limited. If you do not have the potential to cultivate but still insist on entering the books, it will lead to some very bad results. When that happens, please do not complain that I did not warn you." The wooden door of the old library opened slowly. It was quiet inside, as if it was a door to an unknown world. There was no dust or cobwebs, but it gave people a sense of vicissitudes. The students outside the building were silent for a while. They tidied their clothes and calmed themselves down. Then they stepped over the threshold and walked in. The inside of the building was much larger than it looked from the outside. There were many simple bookshelves neatly arranged in the spacious space. The bookshelves were arranged according to the 6 subjects and years. On them were all the books that one could think of. They were of different heights, old and new. They were all nestled together, as if countless sages and celebrities were naughtily looking at you side by side. The students quickly dispersed after entering the building, looking for the books that interested them. Ning-Kei walked among the bookshelves alone, pulling out a book from time to time to read. Then he found a writing table by the window of the library. There were writing brushes, ink, paper and inkstone on the table. He could not help but wonder why these things were prepared if they could not be copied. Ning-Kei found a book of Wang Xinglong's regular calligraphy in the South Jin Kingdom library. He took one out and read it as he walked. Gradually it became quieter. He looked up and saw a clean staircase in front of him. The staircase was used to go upstairs. Now that he was on the first floor, above the staircase was the second floor. Oh! She did not know how many new students of the academy were lost in books, until they could not bear the mental impact and fainted. However, it was extremely rare to see someone like Ning-Kei, who had already begun to read and could control his mind with a strong willpower to close the book again. Ning-Kei did not know that he had attracted the attention of the female professor. At this time, all his attention was on the thin book in his hand. After he finished regulating his breath, he felt that his spirit and physical strength had returned to normal. Without hesitation, he opened the cover of the thin book again and continued to read. Just now he saw the 2 words mutual affinity, so he continued to read from there. However, this time when his eyes fell on the 2 words, he suddenly felt that the 2 words floated into his mind and stirred up an extremely turbulent sea wave. With a boom, thousands of mountain-like waves came crashing over. The hand and the book in front of him disappeared. He stared blankly at the bookshelf gradually sinking and the densely arranged books in one place. Finally, he saw a snow-white roof, and then darkness, the darkness of the deepest part of the sea. A horse carriage stopped in front of the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street. The curtain was lifted and Ning-Kei stepped out of the carriage. He bowed to the coachman and the deacon of the academy in the carriage and said very sincerely, "Thank you very much." As the horse carriage drove away, Ning-Kei took a deep breath and rubbed his pale cheeks. He walked into the shop and looked at Sang-Sang, who threw away the rag in her hand and looked at him with curiosity and hope. Ning-Kei forced a smile and said, "The academy is really the best place in the world but also the worst place in the world." He had fainted in the old library, and did not wake up until the horse carriage was about to enter the Vermilion Bird Gate. He did not remember how he fainted at all. What made him feel more frightened and lost was that he even forgot the content of the book he was reading before he fainted. No matter how hard he tried, there was not a single memory in his mind. But I have to warn you, those mysterious books that you are curious about cannot be memorized. You can only experience them. As for the reason, I will not explain it. After all, human power is limited. If you do not have the potential for cultivation but force yourself into the books, it will lead to some very bad results. Now he finally understood the true meaning of the warning from the academy instructor in front of the old library. He even faintly guessed that those books on cultivation on the bookshelf should be written with some kind of talisman technique. There are many books on cultivation in the old library. I thought that you should be there. Ning-Kei looked at Sang-Sang and remembered the scene many years ago, when he held a weak little girl like a mouse and ran to the bookstall in Linping Market. He said softly, "But it seems to be very troublesome to understand those books. It feels like there is a mountain in front of me. Young master, can't we go around it?" Sang-Sang raised her little face and asked with concern. Ning-Kei shook his head and looked at her quietly. He asked, "We have discussed before. What if we can't go around a mountain?" Sang-Sang nodded hard and said, "Split the mountain." Walking up the stairs, he found that among the empty bookshelves, there were fewer students than yesterday. But most of them were carried out, not because they were afraid of difficulties and did not want to go upstairs. Those who could enter the academy were all capable people, who would be willing to give up on the second day. But looking at those young students' pale faces and swaying bodies as if they were drunk, Ning-Kei was afraid that none of them could hold on for too long. From time to time, dull thuds could be heard, like the sound of ripe fruits falling onto the ground in autumn. The students beside the bookshelves kept falling down, either convulsing and fainting, or foaming at the mouth, looking at the sky listlessly. It was a very miserable sight. At this time, Ning-Kei was still holding the book, a preliminary exploration of Snow Mountain and Ocean of Qi in his hand. He withdrew his eyes from the unfortunate fainted classmates and did not have the time to pay attention to others. He took a deep breath and opened the book with a solemn expression. Heaven and earth have breath, it is called breath. The difficult climbing of the book mountain had to start from the first step, because he only remembered holding this book before he fainted yesterday, but did not remember what he had read and where he had read. He had foreseen in advance how helpless and repetitive the process of reading would be in the future, and every time he began, he would have to start from the first sentence. As expected, the handwriting on the thin book became blurred again. Those clusters of ink stains like ink drops falling into the clear water urn quickly dispersed. Ning-Kei was unmoved and continued to read quickly. Man is the spirit of all things, so he can understand the way of nature. The willpower is the psyche power. The blurred handwriting once again drifted away from the paper and began to buzz and vibrate in his mind. Ning-Kei felt that the vibration was not even like paddling, but more like the cold wind on the grassland. He felt that he was fighting with countless fierce horse gangs. He took a deep breath and forcibly raised his head to rest for a moment. Because the movement of raising his head was too firm and tough, his neck muscles were a little dull pain. In order to dispel the annoying feeling in his chest and abdomen at this time, he suppressed the infinite temptation of the thin book in his hand. He looked out of the window at the spring trees and other classmates beside the bookshelves. A small figure leaned against the bookshelf and collapsed weakly. It was Lin Chuan Wang Ying. Then Ning-Kei noticed that in the deepest part of the bookshelf, Xie Chengyun was sitting on the ground with his legs crossed. He slightly lowered his eyes and quietly looked at the scroll on his knees. Although his eyes were still bright, his face was extremely pale. They are all trying hard to climb, Ning-Kei said quietly. What's more, what he has learned in the building will be good for his cultivation. But your physique is not suitable for cultivation at all. You can only rely on your willpower to hold on here, which will do you no good. It's better to go back early. Ning-Kei stood where he was and kept silent for a long time. Suddenly, he bowed deeply to the female professor and asked sincerely, "May I ask if you are at the upper state of see-through?" The female professor shook her head. Ning-Kei understood. He smiled gently and continued to ask, "May I ask if you had reached the upper state of see-through when you first entered the academy?" The female professor smiled and understood what he meant. Ning-Kei bowed deeply to the ground again and said sincerely, "I want to continue to read for a few more days." The female professor looked at him with appreciation and said, "After all, you still have to act according to your ability. If you are stubborn, don't blame me for stopping you." "Yes, sir." Not long after this conversation, Ning-Kei and Xie Chengyun fainted again one after another. The four deacons in academy robes had long been accustomed to this, and even knew their weight clearly. They picked them up expressionlessly and went downstairs without saying anything. The dense green of the forest in late spring penetrated through the window to the second floor of the old library. The female professor looked at the spring scenery outside the window and shook her head with a smile. Then she lowered her head and continued to write her regular script. Just then, the instructor of the old library came up from downstairs and came to her. He bowed very respectfully and said, "Teacher, I have one thing that I don't understand." The female professor looked at him and said gently, "I have also found some wonderful things that I don't understand recently. We might as well discuss them together." The instructor of the old library sighed and said, "I've been watching these two students for a few days. Xie Chengyun has the foundation of cultivation and extraordinary perseverance. It's not easy for him to stay upstairs for so many days, but it's not rare after all. But Ning Ke is obviously immortal, so why can he stay for so long? It doesn't make sense. The female professor looked at the ink gradually stained on the tip of the elegant brush and said softly after a moment of silence, I remember many years ago, the teacher once said that if a person's willpower is strong enough, then even God will be afraid. I think this child named Ning Ke is probably such a person with strong willpower. For the next few days, things seemed to be as usual. They attended classes in the morning, had lunch at noon, and went upstairs in the afternoon. Under the gaze of all the students and instructors of the academy, Ning Ke and Xie Chengyun went upstairs one after another, and were carried out one after the other. Because the door to the second floor is on the second floor of the old library, Situ Ilan said grumpily, I know it's a little hard to say, but you only need to know that it is very difficult to enter the second floor of the academy. I heard that only 7 or 8 people have entered in the past 10 years. Since you don't have this idea, why do you want to get involved with Xie Chengyun? Ning Ke looked at her and said with a smile, you mean in order not to affect Xie Chengyun's cultivation and not to hurt his confidence to enter the second floor, you should ask me to give up voluntarily? As soon as these words were spoken, the surrounding crowd went silent because such a request didn't make sense no matter what, and it seemed to be extremely rude. Jean Wucai, who had been standing silently beside Situ Ilan, bit her lower lip and broke away from her companion's hand. She walked to Ning Ke and bowed very seriously. She said in a slightly trembling voice, Student Ning, please help me. Xie Chengyun vomited blood after returning home last night. He really can't hold on anymore. It was the first time that Ning Ke knew that the young man who went upstairs with him every day had paid such a heavy price for this. He fell into silence thinking of his vomiting every night and the concern on Song Song's little face. At this moment, Zhong Dajuan looked at him coldly and said, Do you need to beg this kind of person in a humble manner? I don't believe that an ordinary person can stay upstairs for so many days. When Chengyun was upstairs crying blood and reading every day, who knows what he was doing upstairs? Maybe he was just resting with his eyes closed. Xie Chengyun was a gifted scholar from the South Jin Kingdom. When he passed through Yongguan, he stayed in Zhong Dajuan's mansion. They were well known and appreciated each other, so they got along very well. Zhong Dajuan had already been extremely angry seeing his friend being forced to go upstairs by Ning Ke every day until he vomited blood last night. Of course, even he himself did not know the real reason that made him say such a malicious speculation was that he was unwilling to let all the academy's attention be taken away by the soldier from the border town. The malicious speculation seemed to be very consistent with the real situation, so the students looked at Ning Ke in a somewhat complicated way. At this moment, 2 carriages came along the stone path outside the building. Xie Chengyun, whose face was snow-white, was helped to get off the carriage. He stared blankly at this side, but never said a word. Situ Ilan looked at his back in astonishment and asked in confusion, Is there anything more important than pride? Ning Ke did not answer her. He thought to himself that some things were more important than pride, such as life and death. Ning Ke, you have to think about the consequences of going upstairs today. Zhong Dajuan said coldly behind him. He had also noticed Xie Chengyun's arrival. Since Xie Chengyun kept silent, he thought he knew what to do, so his voice became harsher. Hao Yan has given its people everything. All you need to do is accept it. This time there are so many people here. Most of them can't cultivate, but we are not like you who are unwilling to give up and even jealous. I know very well what you want to do. You know you can't enter the second floor, so you use some evil tricks to make Chengyun unable to enter the second floor. But have you ever thought about how sinister and shameful it is to harm others without benefiting yourself? Hearing the term second floor again, Ning Ke finally remembered that Liu Qingchen and the great swordmaster assassin had mentioned it in the fight at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. He could not help but stiffen slightly. A mere abandoned disciple of the academy became a great swordmaster of see-through state after learning on the second floor for a few days. The second floor of the academy? What kind of place was it? His silence and his slightly stiff body gave a wrong signal to the students in the building. They thought that Zhong Dajuan had hit the nail on the head and exposed his intention, so he was embarrassed and in the wrong. Just as the discussion gradually started, Ning Ke slowly turned around at the entrance of the stairs, with a trace of strong sarcasm on his pale and thin face. He looked around at the crowd and said, "I didn't know what kind of shabby place the second floor was before, so I didn't want to enter it. Now that I know what kind of shabby place it is, I will definitely enter it. I hope no one among you will be surprised at that time." Zhong Dajuan was so angry that he laughed coldly and said, "You still don't admit that you are jealous of Mr. Xie?" There were 2 carriages parked outside the old library. One of them sent Xie Chengyan, who vomited blood last night and asked for morning leave, to the front of the building. The other one was an ordinary carriage with indigo curtains, but no one got off and the curtain was still. At this moment, a cold voice suddenly sounded in the carriage with indigo curtains. "I only know that the flowers in the greenhouse will be jealous of the high cliff snow lotus, but I never know that the goshawk in the sky will be jealous of the chickens on the ground." The voice was not so harsh, nor did it carry a strong sense of sarcasm, but it directly made the students inside and outside the old library silent. Zhong Dajuan's expression was extremely ugly, and Xie Qingyun's snow-white face even faintly showed a trace of irrepressible shame and anger. Because the words spoken by the person in the carriage not only raised Xie Qingyun to a very high position, as a snow lotus on the high cliff and a soaring eagle in the sky, but also directly regarded Xie Qingyun, the well-known talent of the aristocratic family in the South Jin Kingdom, as a flower in the greenhouse that had not been weathered by wind and rain, and those chickens pecking on the ground all day long. A simple sentence returned all the previous sarcasm to Ning Ke with countless times of strength. Everyone was shocked and looked at the carriage, wondering who dared to ridicule Zhong Dajuan of Yangguan and Xie Qingyun of the South Jin Kingdom. Just when Zhong Dajuan was ready to ridicule back and some people were ready to speak angrily, the person in the carriage with indigo curtains continued to speak indifferently, aiming at the 2 noble ladies of Chang, and who were inexplicably nervous at the moment. Since his skills and perseverance are not as good as others, then he should sharpen himself well and seek the final victory. How can he let a woman plead for him? "Wu Cai, you have been a smart and sensitive girl since childhood. How can you become so stupid these years? And Elan, you even helped the people of the South Jin Kingdom to ridicule the Tangs. Where is the strength that you used to ride a horse on the street when you were a child, crying and holding your father to go on an expedition to the South Jin Kingdom? Strength is not proved by ridicule. Our Tang Empire relies on swords and arrows after all. Go back and reflect on yourself." The person first ridiculed Xie Qingyun of the South Jin Kingdom, and then severely reprimanded the 2 noble ladies of Chang'an. His tone was calm, but there was an irresistible strength in it. Especially after being reprimanded, Situ Ilan and Jin Wucai did not show any anger, but lowered their heads in shame. The students inside and outside the old library felt that something was wrong, and could not help but be curious about who was in the carriage with indigo curtains. The voice in the carriage with indigo curtains sounded again. "Ning Ke, come here." There was dead silence inside and outside the old library, especially when Situ Ilan's cautious eyes confirmed the identity of the woman in the carriage with indigo curtains. They subconsciously bowed to salute. Zhong Dajuan's face became extremely ugly, not because of anger, but because of fear. Although he was born in a big family in Yangguan, as long as the person in the carriage with indigo curtains said something casually, he was afraid that his future career would be terminated. Xie Qingyun's cheeks were whiter than before. Although he was not a Tangs and did not have Zhong Dajuan's worries, as a person of the South Jin Kingdom, how dare he provoke the person in the carriage? According to the etiquette of the Tang Empire, only the Empress Dowager or the Empress could call themselves the Empress. If there was an elder princess in the imperial court, she could also call herself the Empress. But there was no Empress Dowager or elder princess in the Tianqi dynasty, so the only one who could call herself the Empress was the Empress. But it was impossible for the Empress to come to the academy in a carriage, so there was only one possibility. In the Tianqi era, there was a princess who was specially allowed by the imperial court to call herself the princess because of her virtue. In the carriage with indigo curtains sat the most beloved 4th princess of the Tang Empire, the most respected 4th princess of the Tang Empire, and the idol of young men and women of the Tang Empire. Who dared to offend her? Ning Ke was slightly surprised. Under the strange gaze of the students, he walked out of the old library and slowly walked to the carriage with indigo curtains. Only then did he notice that the groom wearing a bamboo hat was Peng Yutao. Peng Yutao smiled and nodded, saying, "Her Highness wants to talk to you." Ning Ke smiled and nodded. He walked to the side of the carriage and bowed slightly, saying calmly, "Your Highness." Liu lifted a corner of the curtain and quietly looked at the lad whom she had not seen for a long time. She suddenly said, "Since you have entered the academy, you can call yourself a student when you see me from now on." Ning Ke looked at the beautiful and pleasant face through the corner of the curtain. He did not know why he suddenly thought of the bonfire at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. He smiled and lowered his voice, saying, "Since you are not a teacher of the academy, why should I be your student?" Liu was slightly stunned. She did not expect that this naughty lad would still be so naughty even after she had regained her dignity as a princess. She could not help but slam the curtain heavily and said coldly, "I came to the academy for some business today. I thought that you were studying in the academy, so I came to visit an old friend. I mainly wanted to tell you that I miss Sang. Tomorrow, bring her to the princess mansion for me to see." At this time, separated by the cyan curtain, Ning Ke could not see the face of the maidservant, which reminded him of the maidservant at that time. Ning Ke became much calmer and more normal. He bowed respectfully and said softly, "Your Highness is considerate." The curtain was lifted again. Liu quietly looked at his pale cheeks through the gap and slightly frowned. After a moment of silence, she said, "I heard that you go upstairs every day these days. I advise you to take care of your body. Don't lose your life in a fit of pique. Why do you have to be angry with these people? Saving your life to serve the country is the right way." Chapter 88. The carriage with the indigo curtain slowly moved away along the stone path by the wetland. The seemingly flat slate was uneven, so the soles of the shoes would not slip easily, but the hard wheels would be violently shaken. In the carriage, Liu, the fourth princess of the Tang Empire, was in a daze, holding her chin. She was a little annoyed, so she increasingly felt that Ning Ke was very annoying. She came to the academy today for nothing else but to see Ning Quebec. She wanted to see how the lad who had accompanied her back from the grassland had become. She wanted to know what was so special about the guy who had refused her recruitment, but had followed old Chow from the Spring Breeze Pavilion to kill on a rainy night, and caught the attention of Su Chongshan. The most direct reason was that 2 freshmen in the academy had entered the second floor of the old library for more than 10 days in a row. This strange thing had spread out of the academy and reached her ears. When she knew that one of the freshmen was Ning Ke and thought of Liu Qingchen's evaluation, she could no longer suppress her curiosity and decided to come and have a look. At first glance, it was still that ordinary but childish and clean face. There were still a few freckles and shallow dimples, but his face was much paler than before and looked extremely unhealthy. She did not know why. Looking at Ning Ke's pale face and the stubborn and sarcastic expression on his face, she was a little annoyed. If it were not for Zhong Dajuan's sarcasm, which irritated her, perhaps she would not have asked him to come. Ning Ke walked into the old library, and the eyes of the surrounding students were completely different from before. They were full of shock and confusion. Everyone thought silently in their hearts, could it be that the record on the academy's roster is wrong? This person is not a soldier from the city of Wei, but a disciple of a big family in Qinghe Prefecture as the original legend says? If not, how could the fourth princess know him and even specially summon him to the carriage for a few words? Situ Ilan slightly tilted her head and curiously looked at him, probably also guessing the relationship between him and the princess. Jean Wucai hid half of her body behind Situ Ilan, and was a little ashamed to look at him. Princess Liu had personally ridiculed Ning Ke, who dared to continue to question him. The embarrassed Zhong Dajuan had hidden somewhere at this time, while Xie Chongyun stood outside the crowd with a pale face, looking a little lonely. Chu Yuxian walked to Ning Ke's side and looked at him in surprise. He said in a low voice, "No wonder Mistress Jian didn't want to take your money. I didn't expect you to have such a strong background." According to the temperament of Situ Ilan and the other girls, Even if you bring out the prince today, it may not work. Only the fourth princess can deal with them. Upon hearing this, Ningke became interested and asked, "What's the reason?" Chu Yuxian laughed and said, "The reason is simple. The so-called Chong, an army of women, was originally created by the fourth princess when she was bored. Noble ladies like Situ and the others were all brought up by the princess." Ningke smiled and did not explain the relationship between him and Princess Liu. He did not have the thought of using the tiger's skin to make a coat, but he was willing to make this relationship even more ambiguous. Seeing Ningke walking to the second floor, Xie Chengyun finally moved. He slowly walked into the building, ignoring the obstruction of the people around him. He held the railing with his hands, and his body kept shaking, moving up step by step with difficulty. Ningke held the thin book, a preliminary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow, but did not open it. After Xie Chengyun walked past him to the deepest part of the bookshelf and sat down cross-legged as usual, he suddenly said, "You may have your pride, but I also have my own needs. You're the god's favored one, while I'm just a desperado who wants to live. There's a big difference between the two. I suggest you don't lose your life in order to compete with me for a short time." When Xie Chengyun walked past him, he saw the book in Ningke's hands tightly closed. He thought that Ningke was angry at his previous silence downstairs, so he wanted to continue to gamble with his life. But he did not expect that Ningke would say such words. The gifted scholar from the South Jin Kingdom, who had been intelligent since childhood, kept silent for a long time and stared blankly at the pages on his knees. No one knew what he was thinking. Then he stood up with difficulty by holding the wall, made a deep bow, and slowly walked downstairs. The deepest part of the bookshelf was close to the west window, where the sun could be seen in the afternoon. Ningke walked there with the thin book and sat down in the warm sunset. He sat down cross-legged on the floor where Xie Chengyun had sat for many days. After closing his eyes for a long time, he gently rubbed his pale and thin cheeks, opened the book with a smile and continued to read. You can make some notes. Although they can't be copied or taken away, they may be helpful. The female professor in a light-colored robe was standing beside the new branches of an old tree by the east window. She did not even raise her head. She was concentrating on her small regular script. If Ningke had not confirmed that he had heard her, he would have suspected that she had not spoken. He was slightly startled and stood up. He walked to the table beside the west window and looked at the writing brush, ink, paper and inkstone on the table. He sat down after thinking for a long time. He picked up the ink block with his fingers and began to grind it in the clear water. The books in the building were strictly forbidden to copy. Why should I imitate others to say that the weather is cold? You should know that it is not autumn yet. He picked up the brush and began to write casually on the paper. He didn't have any specific thoughts in mind. He was just writing according to his thoughts at this moment. As the tip of the brush wrote clear and beautiful words on the paper, the feeling of extreme annoyance in his chest seemed to be gradually erased by the brush, disappearing without a trace. I have been in the building for 17 days. I have practiced hard every day, but I could not cultivate the words into my heart. I could only watch them slip away. I have been sober and have fallen into a dark and sweet dream for no reason, but they are always not there. If they are illusory on the paper, why can I see them? If they are real, why can't I remember them? If they exist between reality and illusory, is the ink that wrote them real or illusory? Is the paper that carries them real or illusory? Since he was just casually expressing his mood, Ningke suddenly did not want to write anymore. So he put down the brush and looked at the words on the paper quietly. When the paper was dry, he gently put it into the thin book and put the book back on the bookshelf. He turned around and bowed respectfully to the female professor by the east window before walking downstairs. For the first time in many days, he walked downstairs by himself instead of being carried downstairs. The female professor looked up at the young man's somewhat disappointed back and sighed softly. She silently thought of the rules set by her teacher in the old library. Among thousands of trees and thousands of sails, students were only allowed to choose one branch and one wind. Although this student was strong-willed and the psyche power accumulated in meditation was not weak, His snow mountain and ocean of chi acupoints were blocked. In the end, he could only end up vomiting blood and lying in bed weakly. Even if Hao Yan pitied his tenacity and granted him health, what was the use of watching him like this for another 80 years? The dusk gradually deepened and the night was coming. No one else went up to the second floor. The female professor packed up the ink, paper and inkstone in front of her, and walked along a side path in the building toward the back of the mountain. After a long time, the academy and the mountain behind the academy were shrouded in darkness. The academy buildings in the wide meadow were lit up and scattered everywhere like stars in the sky. In the depths of the silent second floor of the old library, a few strands of intricate carvings on the bookshelf against the north wall suddenly brightened for a moment, and then slowly slid to the side silently. A fat young student in a dark cyan academy robe squeezed out from the gap, panting. He angrily looked back at the bookshelf and complained, "I don't know who designed this thing. Didn't they know to make the exit bigger? Didn't they think that the academy would also recruit a few fatties?" The fat lad mumbled to the bookshelf and mumbled, "Second brother is a bad guy." He insisted on using the entry-level books as a bet. "Although I, Chun Pippi, am a rare genius, how can I still remember the things I read when I was young?" Talking to himself, he pulled out a thin book from the bookshelf and looked at the word, "A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Chi and Mountain of Snow" on the cover. With satisfaction he gently patted it. As he patted, a very thin white paper flew out. Oh! Chapter 89. Looking at the white paper at his feet, the fat lad named Chun Pippi was slightly startled. His eyes, which were as thin as grains of rice, quickly rolled a few times, and his cheeks, which were like steamed buns, squeezed out 2 wrinkles with great difficulty to express his doubts at the moment. Then he thought for a long time and finally made a very difficult decision. He painfully squatted down his fat body, stretched out his short and cute right hand, and struggled to pick up the paper. Then he took a few deep breaths. Being a fat man is really the most pitiful thing in the world. Chun Pippi's smooth and tender thick lips trembled, and then he lowered his head to look at the handwriting on the paper, and subconsciously read out, "A few floors higher and a few floors higher. All the previous worries are now over. I was originally a woodchopping lad by the Shibby Lake. Why should I imitate others to say that it's cold? You should know that it's not autumn yet. Being a fat man is not the most pitiful thing in the world, if this fat man is a genius fat man." He pitifully looked at the handwriting on the paper, and guessed that it must be the painful self-narration of a new student of the academy. He shook his head and sympathetically said, "Compared with a genius like me, an ordinary person like you is really pitiful. The world of mortals and geniuses could never be interconnected." Chun Pippi could understand the poor guy's distress and despair, but he did not intend to treat the guy's pain as his own. He casually commented on the poor guy, and then put the thin paper back on the bookshelf. He held the book he wanted, A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Chi and Mountain of Snow, and was ready to leave. Suddenly he turned around and took out the thin piece of paper again. Looking at the densely packed handwriting on it, his thick eyebrows raised a little on his smooth and plump forehead. He said in surprise, "This guy's handwriting is pretty good." After praising him, he put the paper back on the bookshelf and was ready to leave again. He turned around again, took out the thin paper again, and looked at it carefully for a long time. Then he praised, "It's not bad, it's very good." Chun Pippi found that his behavior at this moment was somewhat abnormal and ridiculous. He opened his mouth slightly and looked at the feelings left by the poor guy on the paper. He muttered to himself, "Could it be that even Master Hao Yan feels that you are too pitiful? So he wants to use this good writing to persuade me to help a poor person like you?" Sometimes people just needed an excuse to make a decision, even if it was a made-up excuse. Tonight, Chun Pippi didn't know what he was going to do next would change someone's life in some sense. He just wanted to do something, so he did it. From this point of view, he was indeed more carefree than some poor person. Chun Pippi walked to the desk by the east window and sat down. With the help of the starlight, Chun Pippi looked at the poor man's next words with great interest. His fat fingers tapped on the window from time to time, and there were nocturnal birds singing outside. "I've been in the building for 17 days, And I've been practicing hard every day. But I can't get the words to enter my heart. I can only watch them slip away. I've been awake before, and I've fallen into a dark and sweet dream for no reason, but they're always gone. If they're illusory on paper, why can I see them? If they're real, why can't I remember them? If they exist between reality and illusory, then is the ink that they're written on real or illusory? Is the paper that carries them real or illusory? After reading these words, Chun Pippi pouted, and his fat face was full of disapproval. He was like a boy who had eaten countless bowls of authentic Zhongshan Road hot and dry noodles in West City, and saw a poor guy who didn't know how to stir the improved spicy sauce noodles with a frown. Chun Pippi felt proud and conceited from the bottom of his heart. Chun Pippi grinded the ink under the dim light of the night, and the starlight shone into the ink. He used his fat fingers to grab the delicate and fine brush that his senior sister used to use, and wrote a long explanation on the back of the thin paper. Unlike his fat body, the tiny characters on the paper were actually delicate and meticulous to the extreme. Poor guy, don't believe in the nonsense of seeing a mountain is not a mountain, but seeing a mountain is still a mountain. If Lord Haoyan has nothing to do all day and gives us these questions, wouldn't it be too boring? Of course, the things that exist objectively are real. For example, the handwriting on this book is more real than my pride and conceit at this time. Although the divine talisman master has tampered with the handwriting, you have to believe that it's real. If you can't believe it yourself, then your eyes naturally won't believe it. The handwriting is objective and real, and the paper is also objective and real. But when the paper and the handwriting reflect the spring sunshine outside the window and into your eyes, which are not sure whether big or small, and then it's understood by your brain, which is not sure whether you're smart or muddle-headed, I guess muddle-headed, then it becomes an illusory existence. The spring sunshine reflected on the paper is already an explanation. When you see it with your eyes, it's another explanation. When you try to understand it, it's another explanation. Explanations are often misunderstandings. The more you explain, the more things will be different from the original appearance. If you still can't understand it, then I have to use the crudest example. The objective reality of things is like a naked beauty, which can only be accepted, and doesn't need to be understood by you and me. Just like that naked beauty, no matter whether her breasts are big or small, whether her buttocks are round or perky, whether the hair under her lower abdomen is thick or thin, it's all objective reality, and you can't change her. But when you look at her lecherously, think how beautiful she is and want to sleep with her, these thoughts will become pieces of clothes. Every time you think about it and try to understand it, you will put a piece of clothes on her charming and beautiful body, until finally you have forgotten what she looked like at the beginning, and how big her breasts were. How to solve this problem? It's very simple. Remembering the moment when he first saw her naked, no matter if she was the saintess of the Great River Kingdom or Yi Hongyu of the West Hill Divine Palace, he directly went up to her and simply and violently fucked her, regardless of whether she was the saintess of the Great River Kingdom or Yi Hongyu of the West Hill Divine Palace. Women are meant to be fucked. It's not for you to understand. The brush and ink were written directly in his mind. Chun Pippi threw the book on the ground, and his face was full of spirit and satisfaction. He had been regarded as a rare genius since he was a child. However, after many years of learning from the wise and virtuous sages, he could only listen to them obediently, and never had the chance to teach others so unscrupulously. He praised himself. Although the words are vulgar, the truth is not. I only hope that you won't be driven into chi deviation by these words. When the ink was dried by the night wind outside the east window, he proudly stood up and swaggered back to the bookshelf, the fat on his face trembling. He put the paper back into the primary exploration of the ocean of chi and mountain of snow, and didn't care about the bet between him and second brother on the basic teaching materials tonight. Just as he was about to put the thin book back into the recycling shelf, a trace of hesitation flashed across his fat face. He thought that he had seriously violated the rules of the old library by helping the poor guy. However, then he thought of another sentence that the teacher had said, and his eyes that were as small as mung beans rolled, and then he put the book into the recycling shelf, and then swung his sleeves and walked away. Rules are just a fart. Ning Ke set off from the Lin 47th Street every day before dawn, and returned to Chong and City late at night. Although today was the first time that he had ever walked out of the old library, the night had become extremely dark when the carriage entered the south gate of Chang'an. Chu Yuxian was worried about his health, and specially waited for him to go back to the city today. When the two carriages stopped at the door of the old brush pen shop, the son of a rich family in the eastern city stuck his head out of the second carriage and looked at Ning Ke, who was walking into the shop. Chapter 90. Ning Ke decided not to go upstairs to read for a day. Instead, he would take Sang Sang to visit the princess and kill someone along the way. Sang Sang didn't really like this decision. It was not because she didn't like killing people. She had seen Ning Ke kill too many people since she was a child. She didn't feel anything about it. She just didn't like that Ning Ke still refused to rest for a day in such a physical condition. Although the little handmaiden was in a bad mood, the noodles with fried eggs were still delicious. The reason why Ning Ke didn't put pepper or green onions in the noodles was not because of punishment, but because he often felt nauseous and vomited these days. His stomach and intestines couldn't bear the spicy seasonings, so he had to eat something light. After eating the noodles with fried eggs, Ning Ke washed his feet with hot water until they were almost red. Then he comfortably fell onto the bed. Sang Sang washed her little feet with the remaining water, then poured out the foot washing water and climbed onto the bed. She separated her slender legs and rode on his waist, beginning to massage and soothe his mind. After confirming that he had fallen asleep, Sang Sang gently sighed and raised her right arm to wipe the non-existent sweat on her forehead. She knelt to the other side of the bed, got into her own quilt, and fell asleep with her face against the powder box of Chinjinji Cosmetics store. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by Ning Ke's painful moaning and rolling. She rolled out of the quilt and got out of bed. Stepping on her old shoes, she skillfully used the tip of her toes to pull out the copper basin under the bed. Then she sat beside Ning Ke and patted his back with her small hands, sometimes rubbing him from top to bottom. Ning Ke lay on the bed with a pale face. He stretched half of his body out and kept retching toward the copper basin below. His eyebrows and eyes were twisted together, showing that he was in great pain. The food he had eaten before had passed through his stomach and intestines, so he vomited the 2 cups of hot tea he drank before going to bed, as well as some gastric juices and bile. Since he began to read books in the academy, he had been tortured like this several times every night. It not only made his body weaker, but also made Sang Sang extremely tired during the day. Every time he fell asleep, the ink characters that he read in the old library during the day would turn into a thick, dark monster, emerging from the deepest part of his mind. Wielding spears and swords, the monsters would swell up rapidly and converge into a big ship, constantly surging in his mind. The blue sea was surging with stormy waves, making him extremely dizzy. His chest and abdomen were filled with disgust, and he had a strong urge to vomit. It seemed like a nightmare, but Ning Ke was very clear that it was not a dream. It was just the aftermath of the surging interaction between the characters written by the divine talisman masters on the second floor of the old library and his spiritual world, in a mysterious way. Enduring this torture every night, if he could remember those ink characters, it would be a reward for his efforts. However, what made him feel extremely disappointed and even infuriated was that when those ink characters were wreaking havoc in his mind, it was as if he was suffering from aphasia and word recognition disorder. He clearly saw those ink characters appear clearly in front of him, and they looked so familiar, but no matter how he opened his mouth, he could not read them and he could not recognize what they were. Every day in the old library, he painfully read books that he could not understand, and every night in the old brush pen shop, he felt dizzy and uncomfortable looking at the characters that he could not recognize. It was not just one day but many days. If it was someone with a slightly weaker willpower, he might have already given up. But for Ning Ke, this kind of inhuman pain and torture was the best opportunity he could find in his 16 years of life. Unless there was no hope in the end, he would never give up. There was a saying that the person who understood you the most was your enemy. This saying was not wrong. In this world, the person who understood General Xiahou the most was definitely Ning Quebec. However, this saying was not complete because no matter how one thought about it, the person who understood you the most was still you. Ning Ke knew himself very well, so he knew that he would never turn back until he was at the end of his rope. He was not worried that his life would be in danger. The female professor had been sitting quietly by the east window. He knew that if there were no accidents, he would insist on going upstairs and reading until his body became weaker and weaker. Therefore, he had to make the most of his time and cross off as many names as he could from the list. The second name on the oil paper was Qian Zixian, the former deputy general of the Xianwei general. As the most favored princess by the emperor, Liu lived in the imperial city all year round, but she also had her own mansion in Chang'an. The next day, Ning Ke and Sang Sang were led to the princess mansion in a secluded place in the southern city. Today, she was wearing a red and black short skirt. The middle skirt was embroidered with beautiful large and strange flowers. Coupled with the deep collar, the skirt had a slightly mountainous feel to it that hung down to the back of her feet, making her look luxurious and extraordinary. "Where is Ning Ke?" Only Sang Sang walked into the back of the princess mansion. Liu slightly frowned and looked at the little handmaiden who was brought in by the eunuch. Then she smiled and walked forward to hold Song Song's slightly cold hand. She said softly, "I haven't seen you for a long time. You little girl, why don't you come to see me?" The eunuch was slightly surprised and changed the topic. But the eunuch did not dare to neglect and reported with a bitter face, "That guy insists that there is a difference between a man and a woman, and that it is disrespectful to see the princess in private. So he insisted on waiting outside. Now Mr. Peng is talking to him in the duty room." Sang Sang let her hand hold and explained softly with her little face, "Young master has not been feeling well recently." Liu slightly lowered her eyes to hide the faint disappointment and anger in the bottom of her eyes. She no longer cared about the mud-like lad and took Song Song's little hand to the flat couch. She laughed and said, "I don't know where your mischievous young master got his strength from recently. He runs to the second floor of the old library every day. How can he be feeling well?" "Your Highness, I think the young master is quite amazing." Sang Sang spoke for Ning Ke very seriously. Liu shook her head and chuckled. She stretched out her hand and knocked on Song Song's slightly black forehead. She said, "Little girl, you only think about that young master all day long. You don't even think about how he looks like a decent young master. Speaking of this, I feel indignant. Ning Ke really doesn't know how many generations of luck he has accumulated to be able to pick up a capable and diligent girl like you." As they spoke, the two women, one big and one small, bent their knees and sat on the soft couch with their legs crossed. The fate between people was really wonderful. When Liu first saw Sang Sang in the city of Wei, she felt close to her and pitied her for being ordered around by Ning Quebec. On the journey back from the grassland, Liu often talked to her as a maidservant. She really had some affection for her. Since Sang Sang grew up with Ning Ke, she did not have too many concepts of seniority in her mind. She simply felt that Her Highness was a good person and was willing to be close to her. Liu asked Sang Sang about their experiences after they arrived in Chang'an. Sang Sang honestly told her about the trivial matters such as opening a bookstore and taking examinations. Liu was thinking about the relationship between Ning Ke and Chao Xiaoshu. Suddenly, she felt that Song Song's little hand was cold and rough. Looking at her slightly black face, she could not help but feel pity for her. She said, "I will let you get rid of your slave status and stop following Ning Quebec. You can come to my mansion and be a steward. How about that? I don't want you to serve others. You just need to manage the affairs of the mansion for me." In the front yard of the princess mansion, outside the guardhouse near the rockery pool, Peng Yutao frowned and looked at the pale lad on the chair beside him. He could not help but say, "You were so brave at the northern mountain road. Why are you so pale and weak now? What's going on?" Ning Ke replied, "The story is very complicated, but the fairy tale is very simple and very happy." Xiao Man laughed happily and said, "Then I want to listen to fairy tales." Ning Ke recalled some scenes from the past and could not help but smile. He said, "This happens to be what I'm best at." Xiao Man moved her body closer to him and prepared to listen attentively. Ning Ke thought for a moment, looked at him and said, "You are a little prince on the grassland. Then I will tell you a fairy tale about a little prince, okay?" Xiaoman said excitedly, "Okay, okay." Ningke lay on the bamboo chair and looked at the sky. He said, "There are pythons in the forest. They are very big. After they catch their prey, they don't need to chew it. They just swallow it directly and then sleep for 6 months, using this time to digest the food in their stomachs." Xiaoman opened his eyes wide and said in horror, "That's terrible. Don't they say that fairy tales are all happy?" Ningke glared at him and thought that he was not as obedient as Sang Sang used to be. He said, "It's just the beginning. Don't worry. When I heard this story, I was more interested in the things in the forest, so I drew a picture according to my imagination. It was a big python swallowing a big beast. I showed the picture to other adults and asked them if they were scared. They said, 'What's so scary about a hat?'" Xiaoman clapped his hands excitedly and said, "I see. You drew the snake as the edge of the hat and the big beast as the middle of the hat. Is your picture not good?" Ningke was speechless and continued, "I didn't draw a hat. It was a snake swallowing a beast. Those adults like you couldn't understand it at all. So I just drew the situation inside the python's stomach." Xiaoman looked at him in confusion and asked, "Isn't it a fairy tale about the little prince? Where is the little prince?" "He will be out soon," Ningke explained. "He will be out in a little while." It didn't take long for the teaching nannies and palace maids of the princess's mansion to find the vestibule. At this time, the princess also finished catching up with Sang Sang. Ningke took the little handmaiden's hand and ran away under the suspicious and resentful eyes of the nannies and palace maids. They finished their visit to the princess's mansion as quickly as possible. Walking on the quiet streets of Southern City, the big black umbrella tightly wrapped in coarse cloth kept patting Song Song's thigh. The master and handmaiden walked quietly for a while. Suddenly, Sang Sang said something out of the blue. "The princess is a good person." Ningke looked up at the sky above the street that was separated by the sycamore trees. He looked at the clouds that were getting darker and darker and said, "It looks like it's going to rain." Sang Sang wanted to say something, but Ningke didn't want to say those things. So the former said something out of the blue, while the latter looked up at the sky and said it was going to rain. Sang Sang stopped and looked up at him. She asked, "Young master, why don't you like her?" Ningke felt that it was necessary to let the little handmaiden know his true thoughts. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Because I don't think she is a good person in the traditional sense, although she is really good to you." For some reason, Sang Sang showed a rare stubbornness on this issue. She said seriously, "If Her Highness is not a good person, then why did she go to the grassland? Why is she so good to Xiaoman?" Ningke looked at her quietly and suddenly said, "If she is a good person, then why did she go to the grassland? Why is she so good to Xiaoman? I don't think that all stepmothers in the world are bad people, but I have never seen any stepmother like her who regards Xiaoman as more important than her own life." The same two questions could prove that Her Highness was a good person in Song Song's eyes, but it became the opposite in Ningke's eyes. She didn't understand what he was trying to say, and looked at him in confusion. At this moment, rain gently floated down from the sky of Chang, and in the deep spring, Ningke untied the big black umbrella from her back and opened it. He continued to walk forward and said, "There must be something wrong when things are abnormal. Her Highness's stepmother is still so young. Is she overflowing with maternal instinct? In my opinion, it's too early. I think it's empathy. She transferred her feelings for the Chanyu to the little boy. In this case, she seems to have a lot of apologies for the Chanyu who sleeps on the grassland. Only we, the border army, know how great the Chanyu was. But such a great figure was so inexplicably murdered by his idiot younger brother and usurped the throne? Young master, what are you trying to say?" "What I want to say is that Her Highness will probably regret it for the rest of her life. Because Chanyu should really love her. And he is the only man in the world who dares to really love her." "I don't understand." "Nothing." After a long silence, Sang Sang suddenly said, "Do you think Her Highness killed Chanyu?" Ningke didn't answer her directly, but said, "It seems that your usual stupidity is indeed an act of laziness." Sang Sang lowered her head and walked under the black umbrella. She slightly clenched her small fists and said, "Where's the evidence? There are many things in this world that don't need evidence." Ning Ke looked at the drizzle falling outside the umbrella and said, when she went to the grassland, she could not only defuse the attacks of some swindlers in the empire, but also gain His Majesty's pity by showing weakness in the battle with Her Majesty. She could also win the respect of the Tang people, and even develop her own power on the grassland. But she couldn't stay on the grassland forever. His Majesty is getting older, and the successor has to be decided as soon as possible, so she needs to come back. As the woman Chan Yu loved, there is only one way for her to come back. Sang Sang lowered her head and whispered, but Her Highness was only 12 or 13 when she decided to marry to the grassland. I started killing horse gang when I was 12 or 13. A person's ability is not necessarily proportional to his age. Ning Ke held the big black umbrella and gradually quickened his pace. He shook his head and said, what I said just now was that Her Highness had a reason to do that and could benefit from it. But in my opinion, the most convincing thing is what I said before. We all know how great the young Chan Yu was. Such a great man is hard to be framed and killed, unless the killer is the one he trusted and loved most. Sang Sang lowered her head and pursed her thin lips. She whispered, anyway, it's all your guess, young master. Ning Ke said, I also hope that my guess is wrong. I also hope that the world is full of fairy tales, where the prince and the princess live happily ever after. But you see, the prince on the grassland is dead, and the princess comes home. Sang Sang raised her head, and a drop of rain slid down her dark cheek. She looked at him and asked angrily, young master, why is the world in your eyes always so dark? Ning Ke stopped and looked at her silently. After a long time he said coldly, because the world I saw was so dark from the moment I survived to the moment I found you in the pile of corpses by the roadside. After saying this, he also felt that he had lost his composure. He strode to the front of the street in embarrassment. He didn't know whether it was the shadow cast on his spirit by the old library of the academy, or because he was about to kill someone, but he always felt that the rain outside the big black umbrella was not so refreshing and seemed a little gloomy. Sang Sang stood in the rain and looked at his back. Suddenly she quickened her pace and caught up with him. She caught up to the big black umbrella and the guy, and then reached up to grab the corner of the sleeve of his right hand that was holding the umbrella and never let go again. The conversation between the master and the handmaiden could be heard from time to time under the big black umbrella. I thought you were going to scold Her Highness as an idiot again. Don't be emotional about anything. You will only hurt others and yourself in the end. So she is indeed an idiot. Then why didn't you scold her just now? I will scold her less in the future, because those emotional idiots are all poor people. Oh. He calmly walked down the broken stone steps and looked at the old man squatting outside the woodshed in the courtyard. He said, Chen Zixian. Outside the woodshed, the old man was wearing an old, thin coat. The corners of his sleeves had burn marks from years of fire, and a few blackened cottons were sticking out of the cracks in the brittle cloth. He looked miserable. The old man's white hair was tied messily together. His thick iron hands held an axe and a piece of wood. He was chopping firewood. The old man raised his head, and a strange look flashed in his murky eyes. He looked at Ning Ke, who had pushed open the courtyard door. He looked at the shadow under the bamboo hat, trying to see his face clearly. After a moment of silence he said, I am. Ning Ke stopped and slightly raised his head to look around the shabby courtyard. He confirmed that all the apprentices were indeed in the front square, and there was no one in the courtyard. He turned around and closed the courtyard door. He used his right hand to untie the tie of the bamboo hat around his neck. Then, he slowly held the front handle of the cloth-wrapped padao and continued to walk towards the old retired officer. The bamboo hat fell to the ground in the rain. Chen Zixian slowly blinked his eyes. His left hand that was full of black mud let go of the firewood and wiped it on the front of his clothes. Then he reached behind his waist and grabbed a knife. At the same time he raised his right hand that was holding the axe. He looked at the pale-faced lad who walked out of the wind and rain and said hoarsely, finally, Ning Ke's knife came. The sharp blade, which had been sharpened with rice water at the old brush pen shop on Lynn 47th Street for more than 10 days, was pulled out of the scabbard with lightning speed. It easily cut through the old cloth that was tightly wrapped around the scabbard. It cut through the wind, the rain, and the past, heading straight for Chen Zixian's neck. Chen Zixian raised his knife. When the two knives met, there was a clear hum, and the rainwater on the knife's blade sputtered. At this moment, there was a rapid sound of iron striking in the iron workshop in front, covering all the sounds of knives in the courtyard. In the heavy rain, Ning Ke held the knife with both hands and moved forward expressionlessly. He cut the neck, beheaded the head, and cut the abdomen. The padao stirred the wind and rain, and the knife and axe in the old man's hands rubbed against each other coldly. Dang 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 dang. Beside the red stove, the apprentices numbly held the red-hot iron and waved their heavy hammers to hit it again and again. They did not hear anything because of the loud sound of wind and rain outside the workshop. With a tearing sound, the thin robe was cut open, the axe was shaken off, and the wrist was cut off. Muffled groans sounded in the wind and rain, and the pile of firewood outside the room was scattered on the ground. Hearing the words General's Mansion, Chen Zixian's turbid eyes suddenly became bright, and his expression gradually became relieved. He subconsciously moved his trembling hands on the wet firewood, and stared at Ning Ke's young face and said in a trembling voice, "I see, it turns out. The general's son is still alive, you said. You have been admitted to the academy. It is so good, so good. I have lived such a tiring life these years, and I can die knowing the general's son is still alive and living well. I can really rest in peace. Who is not tired of living?" Ning Ke looked down at the potholes in front of his feet, which were hit by the rain, and said in a low voice, "I have to learn calligraphy, Olympiad math, piano and painting, and I have to sit on the back seat of my mother's bicycle every weekend, and finally I am more familiar with the children's palace than my home. Don't you think I am tired?" Chen Zixian did not understand what he said, and he covered the bleeding wound and shook his head in pain. Chapter 94. The emperor walked slowly to the bookshelf and lowered his body slightly. His slender fingers slowly slid across the neatly arranged books, and then stopped at the deepest part of the bookshelf. This row of the bookshelf contained the tablet stickers and the rare books of the old dynasty that the empire had gathered from the Sun Tian pavilion. He remembered clearly that the last time he tidied up the bookshelf, the books were slightly slanted from left to right. But now the slanted direction was reversed. Could it be that someone had touched my bookshelf? He frowned slightly. His fingertips gently tapped on the edges of the books, and then his knuckles suddenly tightened, lifting the entire layer of books to another direction. Then he saw a piece of paper hidden in the depths of the bookshelf. The emperor took out the piece of paper and placed it on the desk. He looked at the 5 words on the paper, which were dripping with ink. His brows furrowed even more. After looking at it in silence for a long time, he suddenly shouted, "Who touched my imperial study?" A moment later, 3 eunuchs knelt in the imperial study. The 3 eunuchs involuntarily raised their heads and looked at the slightly plump guard commander beside the desk. Their eyes were full of pleading for help. Su Chongshan was in charge of all the guards around the imperial study. The 3 eunuchs did not know why the emperor was angry, so they could only hope that he could stand up and say something. Su Chongshan carefully took 2 steps closer to the emperor and said softly, "Your Majesty, I can guarantee that no one dares to enter the imperial study without permission." The emperor, Li Zhongyi, had always been lenient in governing the country. These officials knew his temper and temperament very well. They did not feel afraid of the emperor as they served by his side every day. However, this matter involved the imperial study, so Su Chongshan did not dare to be careless. The emperor slammed the desk heavily and looked coldly at the 5 big words on the paper. He asked in a cold voice, "If no one dares to enter my imperial study without permission, then where did these 5 words come from? Could it be that it was written by a ghost from the underworld?" He frowned slightly and looked at the 5 words that seemed to be stabbing into his heart. He felt more and more irritated. After a short pause he said, "It's something that happened this month. Look into it for me." Su Chongshan bowed respectfully. He caught a glimpse of the 4 ink words on the paper, and was about to leave when he suddenly thought of the cheeky and bold lad at the beginning of the month. There was a buzzing sound in his head, and his body suddenly became extremely stiff. The people in the palace were very disciplined, and no one dared to enter the imperial study without permission. After thinking about it, it seemed that the only person who had the chance to get close to the imperial study and even enter the imperial study this month was that lad. "What's wrong? Did you remember something?" The emperor looked at his profile coldly. Su Chongshan smiled faintly and said, "I was just thinking that it might have been written by one of the study companions in the palace, and then it was mistakenly kept in the imperial study. Speaking of which, this handwriting is really good." The emperor glared at him angrily and reprimanded, "Am I inviting you to admire my calligraphy? Do you think I don't know if my handwriting is good or not? What I want you to investigate is who had the guts to enter my imperial study and use my brush to write." Su Chongshan smiled awkwardly and left the imperial study. After he closed the door of the imperial study, he slowly straightened his body and walked out of the garden in the pleasant spring breeze after the rain. Only then did he realize that his back had become wet and cold. A moment later, the deputy commander of the imperial guards appeared under the eaves of a cold and gloomy side hall. He stared coldly at the pale-faced eunuch, gritted his teeth and said in a cold voice, "You are also one of my secret guards. At that time I wanted you to bring him to the duty room behind the imperial study. How dare you leave him outside the imperial study and leave?" The little eunuch raised his head and said with a trembling voice, "Your Excellency, you ordered me to clear the area around the imperial study. In that case it would be too conspicuous for me to stay there. Moreover, I did not know that Ning was so bold." He clearly knew that it was the imperial study, and yet he still dared to enter. "What's the use of saying this now? That idiot has already entered." Su Chongshan stared at him angrily and said, "His Majesty wants to investigate this matter now. Judging from His Majesty's expression, if he catches that guy, he will at least be flogged a dozen times. So you have to remember this. That idiot has never entered the palace, let alone the imperial study. Do you hear me?" The little eunuch said with a sad face, "Your Excellency, can't we just offer him up? His Majesty can flog him a dozen times as a punishment. We don't have to bear this responsibility for him." Su Chongshan said with hatred, "Idiot! That idiot is now my subordinate. If His Majesty finds out that the secret guards recruited such an idiot, wouldn't I be laughed to death? If His Majesty is still not satisfied and wants to punish me, who can I go to ask for justice? That's because of Master Chow. His Majesty has to show some consideration." The eunuch reminded timidly. Su Chongshan flicked his sleeves and left. He shouted, "Damn it, do I have to take the blame for that idiot because of Chow Xiaoshu?" Just when Su Chongshan and the little eunuch were about to cover up this matter, the Tang Emperor Li Zhongyi was staring at the calligraphy in the imperial study. Suddenly he walked to the bookshelf and took out a box with a key. He took out a piece of calligraphy from the manuscripts that he rarely showed to others and placed it beside that piece of calligraphy. The first piece of calligraphy was written by the emperor on the night of the Spring Breeze Pavilion incident. He was going to give it to Chow Xiaoshu as a reward to comfort him for being trapped in the Black City all these years and to encourage him to serve the imperial court in the future. However, he did not expect that he would not have the chance to give it to Chow Xiaoshu after a conversation with him. Fish leaping into the sea. Is this not right? His Majesty frowned as he looked at the 2 pieces of calligraphy that were lined up side by side. His eyes moved to the other piece of calligraphy and murmured, "The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore? Can't it bloom on this shore? Can it only bloom when it leaves Chong, and in my Tang Empire?" The emperor's anger came from the fact that someone dared to touch the imperial study. It came from the 4 words that had pierced through the emotions that he had been deliberately trying not to think about. However, as his emotions gradually calmed down, he frowned as he looked at the 5 words, "The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore." Thinking of the dispute between him and Chao Xiaoshu that day, he gradually realized some other meaning. The fish leaping into the sea is my sea after all. The flower blooms on the shore of the other shore is the true heaven of freedom. Since I have trapped that guy for more than 10 years, letting him go is just to pay off the debt. Isn't giving freedom to others the same as giving freedom to myself? The emperor's eyebrows gradually relaxed. He thought of the disappointment he felt when he looked at the wet flowering trees in the morning. He thought of his friend, who was far from him in status but very similar in temperament. He thought that he might be walking on a mountain path with wet trees and flowers at this moment. He felt that he had also left Chang and city, and that his body and mind were free. However, he was, after all, the emperor of the Tang Empire. Even though he had thought it through, he was still a little angry. He looked at the calligraphy and angrily rebuked. Even if what you said is right, I can't let you off easily. I have to find out who wrote this. How dare they mock me? Who wrote this? How could it be written? It's so well written. Having seen through the conflict in his heart, his state of mind was naturally different from before. At this moment, His Majesty really looked at the calligraphy seriously. When he glanced at it previously, he only felt that the framework of the 5 words was right and peaceful. Now that he looked at it carefully, he found that the 5 word, the flower blooms on the shore of the other shore, were slender and well proportioned. The bone strength was strong and hidden in the full ink. It did not stand out at all. It was clear and strong, yet gentle and beautiful. It was indeed a wonderful work. This is really good. The strokes are both square and round, the structure is broad, the posture is charming and proud, agile and elegant, and the strength of character is contained. Who wrote this? It is so much better than me. His Majesty squinted his eyes and raised his eyebrows. His fingers slightly trembled as he brushed across the word, the flower blooms on the shore of the other shore. He could not contain his joy. He knew that his evaluation of the 5 words was not fair. The words on the paper were not only much better than what he had written, they were not inferior to the calligraphy of the famous masters hanging on the wall. In fact, they were even better than them. Just as Ning Ke had sighed with emotion in the imperial study that day, the emperor of the Tang Empire's calligraphy was not very good, but his appreciation level was very high. The more he looked, the more fascinated he became. He even saw the feeling that Ning Ke felt when he was writing these 5 words that day. He felt that these 5 words were like hazy branches of flowers that bloomed on the other side of the sea, gently brushing his back from top to bottom, brushing away the depression and unhappiness that had accumulated over the past few days. Good writing. Really, really good writing. His Majesty only felt that his mind was broadened and his mood had returned to peace. He smiled at the 5 words on the paper and did not hesitate to give his most sincere praise. Suddenly, he raised his eyebrows and slammed the desk heavily. He shouted, "Guards!" After a while, the 3 eunuchs knelt on the floor of the imperial study again. They looked at the deputy commander of the bodyguards, Su Chongshan, for help. Su Chongshan suppressed the uneasiness in his heart and approached His Majesty. He asked, "Your Majesty, I am arranging the bodyguards to investigate in secret, but there is no news for a while." As one of the closest officials who knew His Majesty the best, he knew that His Majesty was not a person who held grudges. Not to mention a small matter like entering the imperial study to write a piece of calligraphy, His Majesty would not pursue the more ridiculous things that happened in the palace as long as it did not affect the political system of the country. He had originally planned to drag this matter on for a few days and then a few months until there was no trace of it. He did not expect that His Majesty would go against his usual wishes and put pressure on him repeatedly. The emperor didn't even glance at him. He looked at the calligraphy scroll on the desk with incomparable fascination. Gently stroking the long beard on his chin, he ordered, "Find out who wrote this. Remember not to startle this calligrapher. Treat him with respect. After you find him, respectfully invite him into the palace. I want to ask him for some advice." Su Chongshan raised his head in shock. A moment later, the deputy commander of the royal guards, whose official robes were wet and dry, reappeared under the cold eaves of a certain side hall. He looked awkwardly at the young eunuch, who had a very interesting expression on his face, and said in confusion and embarrassment, "Yes, the situation in the royal study is like this. Now, it seems that the idiot is going to benefit from a disaster." The young eunuch patted his chest in fear and said with a sweet smile, "Your Majesty, this is a good opportunity. If there is a calligrapher who is appreciated by His Majesty among the secret guards, Your Majesty will be very proud." "There is no opportunity and no glory, at least for now." Su Chongshan looked at his loyal subordinate with a fake smile and said, "You have to remember that the idiot No Ningke did not enter the palace." The young eunuch looked at him in surprise and asked, "Your Majesty, why?" Su Chongshan laughed as if he was crying. His voice was squeezed out from between his teeth and said, "Because we did not admit it before. If we admit it now, it will be deceiving the emperor." The young eunuch instantly understood the problem. He looked like he was crying, rubbing his small fists, and said in distress, "Look at this, how did a good thing turn into a bad thing?" Su Chongshan thought to himself, "Why are you crying here? I have turned a great opportunity to flatter His Majesty into a suspected crime of deceiving the emperor. This is what I should cry bitterly for." Thinking of this, he could not help but feel extremely regretful. If he had taken the blame for Ningke in the beginning, he would not be in such a dilemma now. He was in such a F***king situation where he did not dare to take the hoe when he saw a mountain of treasures. The young eunuch rolled his eyes and looked at him carefully. He suggested another idea. "Why don't you report to His Majesty and say that you did not remember Ningke before, but remembered him after some investigation?" "Idiot!" Su Chongshan was already in an extremely bad mood. He reprimanded him. "You did not remember him at the beginning when it was time to punish him, and now you remember him when it is time to reward him. His Majesty is generous to us, but it does not mean that he is that. It is okay to hide some unimportant things from His Majesty, but if His Majesty thinks that his subjects really treat him as that, then you will know that in front of His Majesty we are that." He forcibly suppressed the anger in his heart and said in a low voice, "We cannot admit to deceiving the emperor. Since we did not admit it at the beginning, we will not admit it until we die." Sitting in the carriage, Ningke easily passed through the south gate of Chang, and with this logo, and drove along the official road to the academy at the foot of the mountain in the south. At this time the sky was just beginning to brighten. When they arrived at the academy and entered the study room, it was inevitable that there would be a lot of noise. Whether they were familiar with each other or not, seeing that their classmate had ended his sick leave and returned to class, the students would always come up to him with a few words of concern. Ningke was quite patient, and he casually chatted with everyone with a smile on his face, but his eyes were looking at everyone's expression. He found that in addition to Chu Yoxian's concern, Miss Situilan and Jean Wutsai's concern was also very real. Today's main class was calligraphy, and it was about the South Jin Kingdom's poetry and the appreciation of various styles. Ningke was fond of calligraphy and stone inscriptions, and in theory, he should be very interested in poetry. But for some reason, whether it was in his previous life or this life, he felt happy when he saw the ink characters, and bored when he saw the poems formed by the ink characters. Therefore, he naturally lost interest in this class. When the bell rang, he politely said a few words to the tutor, and rushed out of the study room to the kitchen. It was still a lunch for two, and he still took 3 laps by the wetland. Those academy students who were quietly watching him could not help but click their tongues in wonder. They thought that Xia3 vomited blood all night and gave up the idea of going upstairs, while Ningke returned to the academy after being seriously ill for a few days, as if nothing had happened. At the door of the old library, Chu Yuxian looked at his face with concern, and said, "You still want to go upstairs?" "Yes." Ningke answered, "It has been delayed for a few days, I have to hurry up." Chu Yuxian shook his head helplessly, and looked at him as if he was looking at a madman, and said, "Haven't you vomited enough? I'll get used to it after vomiting." Ningke answered with a smile. After saying this, he was slightly startled. and felt that this answer was so familiar, especially the last sentence that he said, as if he had heard or seen it somewhere before. Walking up to the second floor, he did not rush to the bookshelf to find the thin book, but instead tidied up his black scarf and robe, and walked to the east window, respectfully bowing to the female professor beside the desk, and said softly, "I'm back." The female professor slowly raised her head, looked at him and said, "Can your body still hold up?" "Yes." Ninkei touched his slightly plump cheeks and said, "I'm sorry for troubling you. I'm not worried about anything." The female professor smiled and said, "It's just that I have been copying books upstairs for 7 years. Although I'm used to the quietness, it feels good to have someone beside me quietly." Ninkei smiled and said, "I'll try my best to stay upstairs for a few more days." The female professor smiled and nodded, and waved her hand to indicate that he could do as he pleased. Ninkei cupped his hands in front of his chest and turned to leave. He walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the thin booklet without even looking at it. He had already memorized the position of the booklet by heart. As long as he walked upstairs, he could find it accurately even if his eyes were blindfolded. It was a pity that he still did not remember the content that he should have memorized by heart. He sighed softly in his heart, and opened the book, A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. He saw the thin piece of paper in it and took it out. He knew that he should have seen it before he went downstairs last time. But he knew that this little trick was meaningless, because this would always be the first page of the book for him. Suddenly, his brows furrowed slightly. He picked up the thin piece of paper with some doubt and looked out the window. He found that the back of the paper was densely packed with ink. He wondered where he had written so many words the last time he was here. He turned over the paper and looked at the back of the paper, and saw that the back of the paper was full of words written in small regular script. Although the person who left the words was very particular about rules and details, it was very strange that the strokes of the words, which were the size of rice grains, were open and smooth, with a strong sense of arrogance. Ninkei looked at the words on the back of the paper in surprise, and then silently read the words left by the person in his heart. "Poor guy, don't believe that the mountain is not a mountain when you see it. Of course, the things that exist objectively are real. For example, the words on this book are more real than my arrogance and conceit. It's just that when the paper and the words reflect the spring sunshine outside the window and into your eyes, and then the spring sunshine reflected on the paper is already an explanation, and when you see it with your eyes, it is another explanation. The objective reality of things is like a naked beauty. When you look at her lustfully, think about how beautiful she is and want to sleep with her. It doesn't matter if she is the saintess of the Great River Kingdom or Yi Hongyu of the West Hill Divine Palace." The warm spring breeze blew inside and outside the building, and the afternoon sun began to turn golden and ruddy. Those male insects bathed in the red clouds began to sing loudly, flapping their wings and squeezing their air sacs, showing their strength and desire to the opposite sex with the wings and sound waves of the wind. Occasionally, when the wind was stronger, the singing in the forest and grass would suddenly stop.